Thank you so much, Berto, and thank you. It is a real pleasure to be participating in this conference. It has been great up to now. I'm just so sorry that I cannot be physically in Bonn. So today I'm going to talk about my joint paper, or paper to be, with Jeff Britton and David Cole on higher education sorting and social mobility. This work is actually in a quite similar vein to some of the discussions we saw yesterday, in particular by Chris in the afternoon and Gregory in the morning. And so it's nice that I can build on some of what they said. I'll be very keen to hear your thoughts as this is very much work in progress. We are getting ready to write the first version of the paper, but you know, as you do so, you sort of notice various things that you should have done differently. So let me start with some very brief introduction by saying, that, as we all know, there's a ton of literature showing that returns to higher education are large, and that education is in this literature seen as a key facilitator of social mobility. However, there is not as large literature, but also large by now, showing that the returns to higher education are also highly heterogeneous. And in particular, they may vary with the characteristics of the students, those of the higher education programs, and how the two are aligned or not. There is also now growing evidence that those from poorer backgrounds may not benefit from the higher education system as much as better off children, both because they are less likely to participate, but also because even among the participants, they are less likely to reach the same level of earnings as they graduate. And in particular, if those from less privileged backgrounds who end up managing to go to college match to worse programs than those from higher socioeconomic status, then the higher education system may not be such a strong equalizer. So in this paper, we want to investigate whether the higher education system is in fact has different returns for children from different backgrounds and why that is. And we also ask whether higher education policy can be designed to improve social mobility and at what cost. So to do so, we take a step back and study the higher education market to then be able to identify the returns to higher education. So we ask in particular, how do students sort into higher education programs in England? And we want to see the extent to which that sorting is determined by the abilities of students, the characteristics of programs, and the returns to the investment. In turn, we also want to know, to be able to inform this sorting and the decisions that students and programs make, what explains the variation in labor market outcomes of university graduates. And then we want to focus on social mobility and ask the extent to which is sorting in higher education, keeping low SES kids from benefiting the most from the system. And then we do ask the counterfactual sort of analysis, and we want to know how does the design of higher education policy, particularly in relation, or we'll pay attention to the funding of higher education and the imposition of quotas, affect the distribution of gains from higher education. So to do this, what we do is to build a structural model of life cycle level supply, earnings, and education with an embedded equilibrium model of the higher education market. This will allow us to separate the preferences of students for the higher education programs from those of programs for the students. And since what we observe in the data reveals a constrained choice, so the choice that say students make given the options that they have available, estimates that are based only on the demand side will fail to account for the unobserved choice set that students face, essentially. And so that's what we want to tackle. Okay, so we then exploit instrumental variation and the structure of the market for identifying the preferences and the returns to higher education, and we will use the model to do some counterfactual analysis. So just very briefly, let me tell you about some of the key findings, although these are not settled. first of all, and this first part is the equilibrium model of the higher education market actually fits the data, the sorting of students to programs really well. And also, and we use one period to run our estimation, and then we validate the model using a reform that happened at the end of the period, so for which we don't use the data. And we can actually also quite closely predict the impact of that policy change, which is a loan reform, tuition and loans reform. We find in our estimates that there is a strong associativeness between student skills and the characteristics of the programs. And we find some complementarity in earnings, but not a super strong complementarity in earnings between, again, the skills of students and those characteristics of the programs, which I'll describe in a minute. They are essentially the quality of the program and the field of study. Once selection is taken into account, this quality does affect positively earnings, but the effect is not super strong. And so when we look at policies, we see that demand-side policies that change the funding of higher education, say loans and grants, they have small impacts on the sorting of students and social mobility. That partly is because of how earnings are composed, and partly is also because, you know, the big disadvantage of low SES kids is that they come into the system already with very different abilities from those of high SES kids, which I will characterize. And therefore, we see that supply-side policies, in particular quotas, are much more effective, but at a cost. Okay, so I'll really skip through these. There is a huge ton of literature, and this slide doesn't make justice to the old literature, you know, that to which this work relates, and that has been developed over the years on the returns to university quality and field of study, on the choices of students going to higher education or not, and what type of education to proceed. Both, as well as more literature on modeling the higher education market, but also on other matching markets that are similar to the higher education market, particularly in England, and also on policy, higher education policies and their effects. Okay, so let me start by describing briefly the institutional features of the higher education market in England, which I think is a bit different from those in the US and potentially more aligned, but not exactly the same as those in some countries of Europe. So students apply during the autumn term of their final high school year, and they will sit actually a final set of exams, which, you know, are important for admissions, only at the end of that year. So before they sit, you know, well before they sit their exams, they will have to apply to university. They choose up to 5 programs, and the programs are a combination of a university and a subject. So they are sort of courses. The system is not like in the US where you apply to a university only. Here, you apply to the university and the subject within the university. So their application contains some measures, some information about their skills. The most relevant probably is a set of test scores that they sit at the age of 16, which are called GCSEs. And these are, you know, on multiple subjects and are sort of universalist. And some of the programs of some universities will also require more indicators of ability. For instance, they may ask students to sit specific tests or that they come to interviews. On the other side of the market, university education is, you know, essentially mostly, for the most part, publicly provided. What this entails is that the number of places is set externally, that exists in each course is set externally, while universities charge tuition fees which are regulated, at least for the periods where I'll be looking at. So there is essentially no variation in prices, and which means that the preferences of students and programs, together with the capacity constraints that the programs have, will determine the assignment of students to places. So the way the matching happens in practice is that universities make offers that are usually conditional on the results of final tests, but are based on the information that the universities can see, during this school. Once the results is known, then the students take the option that they prefer among the possible ones. And if there are field places, which often there are at some universities and some courses, they will go on what is called clearing, which is a stage when all students, regardless of whether they have had an offer or not in hand, they can compete for these places. So there is some reallocation of students to places at that stage, which happens in the summer. Okay, so in terms of funding policy, during the period I'm going to look at, which is this earlier period of 2006 to 2011, which is sort of a stable period in terms of policy, the fees, there were fees to pay at higher education, and these were capped at 3,000 per year. And what this meant is that essentially all courses, all programs charged exactly the same, which was 3,000 a year. And all students, and these fees apply to all students, independently of their socioeconomic status. There were no upfront costs, though, because there were loans made available to students to cover fees and maintenance costs. These loans were only repaid once the students were at work, so they were highly regulated. And the payments were also regulated. They were calculated to be 9% of the gross earnings above a certain threshold, which was £15,000 per year gross. Interest rate was low at an average of about 1.5%, and the loan prescribed after 25 years. So any remaining debt after that period would be written off. Then there was a reform, that's the one I'm going to use for validation, in 2012, which comprised a large increase in the fees, the annual fees of about, they almost trebled, or actually they trebled to about £9,000 per year. The interest rate increased to the retail price index plus 3%, so a big increase there. And the term was extended from 25 to 30 years. So after 30 years, any unpaid loan was written off. To compensate, the threshold for payment increased. So students now would only have to start repaying their debt once they earned at least £21,000 per year, and the proportion that they paid would be on the amounts exceeding that they earn exceeding these thresholds. Okay, so actually maybe I can just show you very quickly so that you know what the type of policy it is. What it meant is that if these are the of lifetime earning distribution of students, these are the expected payment amounts for students under the old regime and under the new regime. And you see that for those not earning very much at all, they didn't pay back very much of their loans, but those in higher earnings, they will pay much more under the new regime than under the old. There are quite a lot of assumptions here about lifetime, the sort of the profile of earnings, but that's to provide you just a small idea about this. Okay, so before I show you some patterns about how sorting happens in England for higher education, let me just tell you a little bit about the data that we are going to use in this analysis. I'm going to use these longitudinal educational outcomes data, LEO for short, which is an admin data set that combines information from various sources. In particular, it contains information from the National Pupil Database, the NPD, which is administrative records of students as they go through school. So you know exactly which schools the student attends at each stage of their schooling careers. You've got the IDs, so you can match students who are in the same school. You have test scores of students, which are national tests run both at ages 11 and at the end of primary school, and at age 16 at the end of secondary school, and then at age 18 at the end of high school. So it's notable that students often don't do their high school in the same school as they do their secondary school. They often move. I'm going to use essentially these age 11 and 16 test scores to come up with measures of skills for these students. And then they have very bare demographic and socioeconomic information. We see gender and cohort, so year of birth. We know ethnicity, and we know where exactly the students live. And also we have index of index of deprivation, which is taken at a local level. It is very local, so it's about a road or about 200 or 300 families per unit. So it's very local, but it's not at the individual level. It's called IDACI, and that's what we use to measure socioeconomic status. Okay, so this data, which follows children through school, is then linked to the Higher Education Statistics Agency, or ISA data, which is data at the university level and field of study of those who enroll in higher education. So we see what program they did and in which university. And this is then linked to tax records, so we can follow the working status and the annual earnings of individuals up to now, essentially. So from this data, I'm going to choose the cohorts who were born in 1998 to 1991. That those children entering university, if they do, in between 2006 and 2009. We've got over 2.5 million children in total in the data, and of those, about 35% enroll in the 3-year university programs. By the way, most programs in the UK are 3 years. And then we can follow their working lives up to the age of 28, and we use earlier cohorts for whom we don't have as much information from the NPD, but do have ISA and tax records to obtain age profiles of earnings and employment beyond the age of 28. Okay, so using this data, I'm going to construct two measures of skills. So I'm going to construct these two measures of skills, which essentially are going to be based on information on the test scores that we see at age 11 and at age 16. So the test scores at age 18, as I told you, are not observed during the application to university. And so we are not considering them. We will be allowing for some unobserved heterogeneity in how universities value students. So we use a factor analysis of the set of test scores at 11, which are English and Maths, and 16, which are English, Maths, Humanities, Sciences, Languages, and Arts. And we use the English and Math scores at the age of 16 as exclusion restrictions. So essentially, I'm going to interpret my two skill measures as a quantitative and communication as measures of the quantitative and communication skills. So what we see when we plot the two skills is that they are really very highly correlated. Students are either good at all or not very good at all, and there is not very much, independent variation between the two. Actually, when we look at the correlation between these two skills, which are plotted here, quantitative on the x-axis and communication on the y-axis, the correlation is about 0.9. Okay, but before we dismiss this, then let me just tell you a little bit about heterogeneity in higher education programs. We are going to consider heterogeneity along two essential measures. One is the field of study or subject, where we are aggregating courses in three types: STEM, which includes science, engineering, maths, and also medicine; LEM, which is law, economics, and management; and the social sciences and humanities, which I call AHSS for short. Then we consider all 150 university institutes in England separately, so we'll have about 450 programs. And to summarize the information about these institutes, we construct a measure of program quality, for which we use scraped data from the Complete University Guide, which summarizes the league tables for the UK. From that information, we construct the first principal component from 5 quality indicators, which is spending in academic services, spending in facilities, research quality, student staff ratio, and the index of student satisfaction. So when you look at the sorting of students into fields by their skill differences, you actually see that the sorting is quite strong. You see that in particular, those who have high beta quantitative skills are much more likely to enroll in STEM programs than those who have a relative advantage in communication skills, who are more likely to enroll in humanities programs. And essentially the same relationship is observed both for women and men. Moreover, we also see that students with higher ability are very strongly selected to universities who have this higher quality measure. So here in sort of this brighter red, which is, you see that students, the average skills of students, or the average quality of the courses in which students who have high quantitative and high communication skills, they are much more likely to go to universities or to programs who have a high quality, and the quality sort of the average quality of the programs gradually decreases with the communication and quantitative skills of students. Okay, so from here, essentially, this is suggestive that this quality measure captures program selectivity quite well. And what about socioeconomic status and sorting in higher education? Well, to start with, we do see from the data that there is a strong gradient of earnings of children with the socioeconomic status index that we are using, so this Iraqi index. Actually, is the negative of the Iraqi index because Iraqi increases with deprivation, and so we just invert it. So this is true for women and men, but also we see that there is really very large differences in the skills of the kids who start to start with. So these indexes that we constructed here, I plot for quantitative skills, but the same thing can be seen for the communication ones. Kids from the high SES backgrounds, which are essentially here the top quartile of the distribution, have much higher, they have a distribution of skills which are essentially shifted to the right as compared with kids from low SES backgrounds. What we also see is that conditional on these skills, enrollment in university is lower among the low SES kids. So they not only have lower SES or lower skills, they are also, even conditional on skills, so for the same level of skills, less likely to enroll in university. And if they enroll in university, they are likely to go to a program which is of lower average quality than those of their peers. And all these builds up to them earning much less when they go into the labor market when they graduate, and even conditional on the quality of the university that they attend. Okay, so in order to understand how these differences are formed, we are going to construct this structural model of the higher education market and life cycle earnings. I'm going to just describe it, as succinctly as I can. It's actually not a very difficult model. So essentially what we are going to do is to divide life in two stages. In the first stage, students decide whether or not to participate in the higher education market. And once they do, meet the programs in a many-to-one frictionless matching market. So tuition fees are set exogenously, like in reality in England, and are uniform across all programs. The preferences and capacity constraints are therefore going to determine the equilibrium assignment. We assume that utility is not transferable between the programs and the students. And then in the second period, the students live their adult lives. They are going to work, to consume, and to save. And we model essentially their decisions up to the age of 60. You'll see that this is sort of the simplest possible life cycle model that considers these dimensions. Earnings will depend on the educational attainment of the workers and the characteristics of both the students or the workers and the programs that they attended. Okay, so let's look first at the program side. We have J programs, which are essentially the 450 or a little bit fewer because some universities don't have all the fields. And the programs are distinguished by their subject field, which is denoted by F, the three types, LEM, STEM, and humanities, and the program quality, which we denote by Q. So these programs care about their reputation, which is essentially reflected in the skill composition of their students. In particular, they care about the mathematical and communication skills that we denote by SM and SC. And an observed skill from the point of view of us, which we call theta. So we are going to also assume that programs have a strict preference for filling their places. And so the preferences of the programs are going to be defined here by this equation, which essentially says that they essentially have linear preferences for each of the skills that we observe as M and as C, and for the unobserved skill of the students, and plus they have a field-specific preference for a student I that is unobserved, but that is unrelated to the labor market outcomes of the students, while the theta may be related. Okay, so on the student side, students are characterized by their skills, which we just said, as we just said, these are three-dimensional, mathematical, communication, and unobserved, and also by the traits X, which are, essentially include gender and socioeconomic status. We are going to assume that students draw value from participating in higher education, which varies with the quality of the program and the field of the program, but also crucially for identification, with the distance from the site of the program, so from their parental residence to the site where the program is delivered, and the choices of previous cohorts in their secondary school, very much, in the same vein of what we saw yesterday. So these two variables essentially are going to provide instrumental variation. They vary at the individual times program level. And so the value of students for a particular program is going to be given by this expression here. So this is the utility cost or value that they have for attending the course, which depends on the characteristics of the course, and these instruments, distance, and the allocation of their secondary school to university, and their own characteristics, plus the individual specific preference, and observed preference for the program J, and plus the value of life cycle value of attending that specific course, which is going to be essentially the discounted value of their earnings and what they consume. Okay, so after graduating, students will move into working life, and they will earn if they work. Their earnings are going to depend on the program that they attend at university, and at the quality of the program, but also on their own skills and the interaction between the two. They also change over time, but in a way that is quite mechanical and exogenous. So it doesn't depend in particular on the experience that they accumulate, only depends on potential experience. So this expression here determines the earnings equation, and they have autocorrelated error term. And so essentially you can see that both skills affect earnings, as well as the unobserved skills, the quality of the university as well, and the interactions, and all the parameters are field specific. So we consider all these interactions. And so the life cycle model then is really the simplest possible. We consider that university students use their loans to consume and to pay the fees while they are at university, which takes 3 years. They start their working life at 22 if they graduate, or at 19 if they do not graduate. And so during their life, essentially they choose whether to how much to consume, how much to save, and whether to supply labor. And this expression here, or the set of expressions, just reflect the life cycle problem that is individuals see when they, when they finish education. And so you've got, the typical budget constraint, where the difference from, the most basic one is that they have to repay a loan, and they repaid a loan in a quantity that it depends on what's the outstanding debt and how much they earn, and they pay taxes on how much on their earnings net of the loan repayments, and the debt evolves according to this expression here. Okay, so what about the match in the higher education market? Well, we consider that this is a centralized market with non-transferable utility. And as I mentioned before, there are no prices to clear the market here. So the program selectivity, that is their capacity constraints, are going to act as prices.
Monica, I have a quick clarification question. What do you assume about earnings? Is there uncertainty about earnings?
Well, yes. So, okay. Students know earnings up to this sort of productivity shock, which is persistent and follows an AR1 process. So that's the uncertainty that exists in earnings. And that's, by the way, independent of the other shocks. They do have, it's completely observable while they are in the higher education market.
But the level of uncertainty is independent of whether they get a degree or not get a degree, or what kind of degree they get. Not its variation. So as you see here, the autocorrelation parameter and the variation in both the initial shock and the innovations in the shock are going to be field dependent. When I say field dependent, it also varies for the non-graduates. Sorry. Yeah.
There's a few questions here. So I'm going to start with one regarding the model from Cyprian. Can the model accommodate students' preferences for peer composition in college? I think it's called repetition here.
So we do not have peer effects in college, which means that no, I mean the individual's preferences for specific programs are going to be independent of who their peers are.
Okay, and then there is like 2 questions about the data. One is about how English is tested in the UK. If it's mostly written tested, it may suggest similar ability compared to math. Question, and then another question was, let me see if I can find it. Can you get information on grades in secondary school?
So the answer to the first one is I'm not totally sure, actually. I'm afraid. So at the GCSE level, I think it's only written. At the SATs level, so at the we used two measures of English. At the SATs level at age 11, I think it has a component that is not written. But actually, you know, this is something that I need to confirm because I'm not completely sure. The second question is I can't remember anymore. Sorry.
Why would you could get information about grades in secondary school?
No.
Okay.
All we observe is the school they attended and the sort of national level grades.
Okay, yeah, so there were some suggestions for what you could do in that case, but you know, I guess we'll move on then.
Okay. So what about the match? This is, as I was saying, a centralized market, non-transferability. Yes?
We are around 5 minutes left, including discussion. So.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So let me just tell you that these types of models, sort of non-transferable centralized markets, do have a stable equilibrium. We are going to assume that our equilibrium is stable. This means essentially that the students, that a student I to be matched to a program mu I must mean that he prefers that if he prefers a program J to program mu I to which he was assigned to, it must be that program J is at capacity with students that J prefers to I. Okay, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the identification, but because it's actually nice, but I think I will have to skip. Just to tell you, it's maximum, simulated minimum distance type of estimator. And we estimate essentially all the parameters of the model together, both the ones in the preferences for higher education and in the market, and for the life cycle, except for two parameters, the discount rate and the coefficient on time in the earnings equation. Let me skip the identification and just tell you a little bit about the earnings. These are preliminary estimates, but they show a few interesting things. First of all, this is not surprising, but the earnings are larger for the LAM courses, for economics, law, and management. Then there are for other graduates and for no university, and they are particularly low actually for those who graduate in humanities. The skills are important, particularly the math skills, but interestingly, the patterns in terms of the complementarities between the skills and the subject are not very clear at all. So math skills are valuable, especially for LAM graduates, while the communication skills look more valuable for the STEM graduates. And both are actually quite valuable for the non-graduates, in some cases even more than for graduates. So it's essentially suggesting that, you know, the skills that you acquire at university compensate to some potentially some lack of skills at that margin. And observability, theta at the bottom has as an importance that which is similar to communication skills. So essentially, one standard deviation increase in an observability increases the average earnings by 4.4%, similar to what the effect of the communication skills is. The program quality, as you see there, also increases earnings, but not super strongly, as you see here, and the effects are essentially linear. The interactions between the skills and the quality, they seem relevant mostly for those for the math skills interaction, and mostly for STEM, but a little bit for the other areas as well. Okay, I had, I'm skipping through the students' preferences. Let's just let you know about the program's preferences. We see a strong complementarity between the type of field and the skills of students. We have STEM course is really giving a very strong preference to the students' math skills, and the humanities course is giving a very strong preference to the students' communication skills, while actually values highly, but in the middle ground, both of them. We fit, the patterns really well. I'm going to skip through all this fit analysis, which is essentially the same figures that I showed you before, but now with both data and the simulations. Social mobility as well. We see the simulations here in dotted and the data in solid, and it's very well fit by the model. And when we look at validation, these are the impacts in blue of the policy change that I told you about by the skill quintile, or quintile actually, of the students, and we see that we can reproduce that effects quite strong, quite closely. Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about how many minutes? 0. Pretty much. So I'll just wrap up. We have some counterfactual policy analysis of 3 policies that change the funding of higher education, essentially by providing maintenance grants for STEM students, all for low SES students only, and scrapping loans for SES students and moving and converting them to grants, again for low SES students, as policy 3, and then a quota system which is totally unrealistic. It reserves 50% of places in each program to low SES students. And what we see is that in terms of, for instance, participation, none of the policies that target the demand for places actually changes very much the participation of low SES kids. The policy that has quotas does have a strong impact. The effects on earnings are also much more muted, and they are due essentially through sorting on the policies that affect the demand for places, but much stronger in the quota policy. But of course, they are compensated by a strong loss amongst the high SES kids. Okay, and I can finish here.
Okay, so I think let's just give her a hand. Yeah. And I'm just, there's one question here from Fedor Ishakov regarding whether there's multiplicity of equilibrium matches in the model. I guess that's a yes or no. And then
we are working on it. Actually, I think no, but we have no proof yet, and so this is we are working on establishing that.
And then I guess there's room for we're kind of running a little bit out of time, but Mike has raised his hand, so just unmute you.
Hi, Monica. It's really great stuff. I just had a observation. It seems to me a really interesting thing you might be able to do with this model is assess the extent to which kids' decisions about what to major in are driven by maximizing earnings versus preferences.
Yes, exactly.
Because that's not what you seem to be planning to do, but it seems like also another interesting thing to do with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's on the cards, Mike. We haven't done it yet because in part this analysis using the model is still slightly preliminary. Yeah. But yes, that's absolutely something that we want to do.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the organizer for putting me on the program and for setting up such an effective hybrid system. As with the others, I'm just very sorry not to be there. Okay, so this is joint work with 2 great co-authors, Giovanni Gallipoli and Aruni Mitra, and it's a paper we've been working on for a while. But I want to talk through the kind of main ideas and then mention a little bit as we're going along how we're trying to extend it and what we're working on at the moment. Okay, so what's the main purpose of this? The main idea we want to understand is how important are parents for understanding the amount of inequality there is within a generation? So we're thinking here about a focus on, you've got a cohort of individuals, a cohort of children, if you like, who are become adults, and among that cohort, how important in explaining the inequality in that cohort is the inequality among their parents. So it's got this kind of clear relation to intergenerational persistence, but it's got a very different flavor to it, which is trying to understand the notion of inequality rather than trying to understand just the kind of level effect for any particular set of children. So let me try and be a bit more sort of concrete on this. So we can think a bit about, so you can think about saying, look, we're trying to understand cross-sectional inequality. Trying to understand cross-sectional inequality and see how it evolves across different generations. And so in a way, if we think about inequality among parents, or actually heterogeneity among parents, so you can think about why that heterogeneity may affect life cycle inequality among their children. And there's a kind of two main drivers of that. So one is going to be, well, clearly how much heterogeneity there is in the cross-section of parents, how much inequality in the cross-section, and also how that passes through from the parent to the child. So if you want to understand the impact of the parents, we've got to understand how much inequality there is in the parents, and also understand the pass-through from the parents to their children. The contrast in explaining the inequality among that child's generation is we can think about essentially the drivers coming from the parents compared to the idiosyncratic drivers of inequality. And so the heart of what we're doing is we're trying to understand how important are the drivers of inequality coming from parents compared to the idiosyncratic drivers of inequality. And I guess the kind of headline kind of result on this is what we end up finding is the idiosyncratic components are much more important to understanding inequality than the parental components. And I can explain to exactly what I mean by that and where it's coming from. So that's one bit of the contribution. It's that central question of understanding the inequality and the parents' role in understanding, in driving that inequality. Second point I want to kind of stress here is that if we start to think about this and why do we think this is going to matter, and I think this is something Eric's talked about a little bit, is trying to get at the bottom in the next talk, is to get to the bottom of what do parents actually pass on to their children. And we split what parents pass on to their children into these three different groups of dimensions. One in terms of earnings ability or potential. So we can think about parents passing on to their children earnings through their education, human capital development, labor market information, innate traits. There's a kind of earnings channel. There's also an access to other income channel. Other income, I mean spousal earnings, spousal income, benefit income, and so on. So you can see there the channel from the parents could be about marital preferences, spousal earnings, can also be intervivos transfers and so on. And then the third channel is about consumption directly. And you can see there that parents can pass on to their children attitudes towards consumption. It can be about how willing they are to save, what their preferences are for expenditure, their attitudes towards risk, and so on. So what we think of as being these three different channels through which parents can impact their kids: earnings, other income, and consumption. And what we think is important in understanding the impacts of parents is that we're modeling these three things together, because clearly there's going to be interactions between the different channels. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to think about the impact of parents on inequality, but we want to think about inequality both in terms of inequality in terms of the earnings inequality, inequality in terms of other income, and inequality in terms of consumption. And we might expect that we're going to end up with differences in how parents' impact on inequality among earnings, parents' impact on inequality among other income, or parental impact in terms of inequality of consumption. And one of the things one of the kind of messages I want to kind of come back to a little bit later on is, how do we think about this in terms of insurance? So do we think about, the consumption measure can be about how do parents provide intergenerational insurance towards their children, may show up in terms of consumption, even if it doesn't show up in terms of earnings and or other income. So that's the kind of main idea. We've got this kind of this understanding that inequality, but then doing it in this way of thinking at the same time about earnings, other income, and also consumption expenditure. So I've got like 35 minutes or so. So I've got two things I really want to do. One is I want to just give some descriptive evidence on the lifetime persistence across generations in these different dimensions. I'll be fairly quick on that. The second thing I want to do is to provide a model to a semi-structural model, a model where we're going to look at that kind of joint evolution of earnings, other income, and consumption across generations. And then we're going to estimate the parameters of that model. So the parameters of that model we need to get out are things like, what's the degree of intergenerational persistence in these different dimensions? What's the degree of permanent income inequality? And what's the covariation between these different channels? And what we're going to end up with, and what I want to kind of get to and spend the last bit of time on, is really trying to show you results that quantify the importance of those parental linkages for understanding inequality in younger generations. Okay, that's the plan. 2 steps, but I'm going to basically talk about the reduced form, then the model, then some estimates, and then talk about this kind of role of parents. I'm not going to get to I doubt I'm going to get to much of the robustness. Okay. So let me start by just mentioning the data, how we're going to do this. What we're doing is we're using the PSID, and we're going to focus, the way to think about this, I think, is to focus on what's the cohorts of children we're looking at. So we're looking at the children who were born in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and we can follow, for those cohorts of children who were born, we can follow the adult lives of those parents and also the adult lives of their children. So to be clear, what we're really interested in here is what happens to adults. So it's what happens to the children when they've actually become adults in terms of identifying what the degree of inequality there is. So we've got the 67 through 2014 data. We're going to focus, when I talk about this transmission, we're going to focus on men. And so the male children born between 52 and 89. And I'll talk, actually, I'm not have time to talk about when we do this with women. Okay, and how that kind of plays out. So the key variables we're going to look at here are what earnings, which is just the labor earnings of the male head of the household. In terms of other income, what we're defining other income to be, it's the transfer income, which is both public and private transfers that both the head of the household and the spouse receives, plus its labor earnings of the spouse. So you can see that the earnings here has got this transmission going across men, and other income is including all other sources of income in the household. And then in consumption, we're looking at adult equivalent family expenditure. Okay, so that's the data. One thing just on consumption, I'm just going to skip over this. What I'm going to show you today is just using food consumption, and because we've got that consistent panel over time. We also do this in the kind of robustness using Orazio and Luigi Pistoferi's imputation process.
I'm going to ask one question here, since it's kind of related. I guess this list you had on the previous slide was an exclusive list, so there's no wealth, no passing on of wealth.
So wealth, I think, wealth includes transfer income. So inter vivos transfers, which come into private transfers, that will include wealth transfers. What other income doesn't include is the accumulation of wealth that an individual may undertake across their lifetime, because what that's going to determine is just this determines the timing of when they're choosing to spend their income, their resources. So I think of wealth as comprising 2 components. There's a kind of external sources of wealth, which increase your total resources. And then there's how you choose to allocate those resources over your lifetime, which generate this particular consumption paths. But so we do include those private transfers, the inter vivos transfers in other income. Okay. So let me just give some reduced form evidence on what the what's going on. So I want to just give this reduced form evidence just to kind of set the scene. This is actually pretty standard, so I don't want to spend more than 2 minutes on this. This is just using the Liam-Solon approach, where essentially what we're doing is just we're regressing. Well, the left-hand side here, this is either the earnings or the consumption of the family of when the child is of cohort H in a particular time period. So this is the think about this as being the earnings in the child's generation. And then we're regressing that on the XP is just coefficient to kind of focus on is the coefficient on XP, which is the parental earnings when that child was age 15 to 17. So this is a historical number. We're talking about, this is the earnings of the child. Think about the earnings of the child when they're age 40, and this is what the earnings of the parent were when the child was age 15 to 17. And this is just a standard Lee and so on approach to try to get at some measures of these intergenerational pass-through. And I want to do this just to kind of set the scene of what these kind of numbers look like, or what the patterns look like. This is just to show two sorts of numbers. The blue number on the top is the total family consumption. This is expenditure. The number on the bottom is your head of household earnings. I guess there's 2 points I want to kind of make. Well, first of all, these are just showing the time series of the intergenerational elasticities for 40-year-olds. So think about the coefficient as being the coefficient on a 40-year-old. And we can normalize it to different ages. If you normalize it to different ages, the actual numbers will differ on the y-axis. But this is just showing over time what that persistence looks like by age 40. There's really two things I want to stress. One is we don't find much of a time trend. So it looks fairly persistent, the degree of intergenerational pass-through. The other thing, which I think is the more interesting point, is that we see here that the pass-through of consumption, the intergenerational elasticity of consumption, is above what it is for earnings. So what that says is, in a way, that the families are providing more insurance within the family in terms of consumption than they are in terms of than happens in terms of earnings. And that, in a sense, was what motivated us to try to think about how these things play through together and how we may think about the interaction between consumption and earnings and so on, because clearly the earnings that people have will feed into the consumption which they end up with. But that's the kind of main, that's just to kind of give you some kind of flavor of what's going on in the reduced form evidence. So let me now turn to the model, and this is, as I said, it's kind of quasi-structural because we're going to abstract from a whole bunch of things, and we have some extensions, but let me just show you roughly what's going on. So let me start by writing down the resources that people have. So these are the resources that we can think about for the parents and the resources for the children. And the resources for the parents in terms of their earnings, we can just think about that as comprising some fixed effect, EFP, plus some transitory component. And then for the other income source, we're going to call that's the N. So E is for earnings, N for other income. This is the earnings of the parent in family F in time T. You can see again, it's got some fixed effect, some permanent fixed effect plus some transitory component. And we talk about other extensions in terms of more nuanced income and earnings processes in the extensions, but this is just to keep it to kind of make it simple in our kind of baseline. For the children, it's completely symmetric, that they've got this kind of permanent component for this fixed effect for children's earnings and a fixed effect for their other income, and they've got these transitory components to it. What's important here is how do parents affect the children's fixed effects? So where are the intergenerational persistence elasticities coming from? So this is the permanent effect for the children, the EFK, first line here. So permanent effect for the children is dependent on three things. One is on the earnings fixed effect for the parents. It's dependent on the other income fixed effect for the parents, and it's dependent on an idiosyncratic fixed effect. So we can think here about and then for other income, it's symmetric. So for other income, it depends upon the parent's other income, it depends upon the parent's earnings, and it depends upon some idiosyncratic component. So the pass-through parameters, there's a kind of direct pass-through parameter which are given by gamma and rho. And those are saying, so gamma tells us how do parents' earnings transmit into children's earnings. And rho says how do parents' fixed effects in other income translate into the children's other income. We've also got these cross effects. So you can see that the parents' other income may impact on the children's earnings. Or we can see that the parents' earnings will impact on the child's other income. So natural ways of thinking about that is lambda could come about because the more a parent earns, the more then they're going to make inter vivos transfers to the child. So lambda is going to capture that sort of relationship between the parental earnings and the children's other income. And similarly, theta is going to capture, if the parents have got more other income, it may mean that they're investing more in human capital, or they're investing more in in their children. And then the two components at the end, as I said, these are the two idiosyncratic components. And you can think of what we're doing is trying to establish, if I think about the underlying inequality in earnings, we're trying to establish how much of it's coming from these two parental channels and how much of it's coming from the child's channel. That's the earnings and other income. If I think about where consumption comes from, well, the most simple way we could write this down is almost, you know, we could think about this as one way of characterizing what we're doing is you could think we're taking a kind of standard, even just a Friedman permanent income model, and we're combining it with intergenerational persistence mechanisms. And that combination is what we've basically got. So the lifetime consumption model, you can just think it's completely standard, maximizing lifetime utility is subject to your budget constraint. The budget constraint, you've got here your earnings of the individual, and you've got the unearned, the other income. You can see I've written this down, being completely agnostic about why individuals, parents may make a choice to pass information or pass resources onto their children. But basically, it's just a standard life cycle consumption model. There's two important ways in which we're working on at the moment to generalize this, to make it two ways we want to generalize it. One is we want to be more explicit about the intertemporal linkages. So we're trying to be explicit here that the intertemporal linkages can come through paternalism, for instance, in which case the income of the children may enter into the utility function of the parents. And you can think about the parents as choosing explicitly transfers that they're going to be giving onto their children. So that's one way in which we want to generalize it, to make explicit some of those intertemporal linkages. Because at the moment, as I said, we've left these in a very agnostic form. The other thing which I think is kind of interesting here is we've not said anything about whether the timing of parental resources matters. Because we do this all through parental fixed effects, we're thinking about it all as being the resources that a parent has over their lifetime. How does that impact on the child's resource that they have over their lifetime? But what we have in practice is it may be the timing of those resources matter. And that could, example, be because of credit constraints, that we want to think about resources parents have early in the parent's life actually makes a bigger difference on their children. But that's two things which I'm not going to talk about more today, but that's just to give us a direction of travel of where we are, where we're going to. I had hoped to talk about this more today, but of course, I haven't. Okay, so this consumption model gives us a fairly straightforward consumption process. But we can think about, you know, if this was roughly, we could think about consumption, consuming just the annuity value of your resources. And in logs, we can think about your log consumption is then going to be related to these different components. So the log consumption of the individual is going to be related to this thing called Q, which I'll come back to in a minute. It's going to relate to the log of earnings of the individual. It's going to relate to the log of their other sources of income, and it's going to relate to essentially these transitory components. The QFT is a kind of shifter which says how consumption will deviate from that discounted just from the straightforward resource calculation, which I'll talk about in just one in the next slide. I'm assuming for the process of the estimation that Q can be represented by some fixed effect and plus some transitory component. So in that sense, it's symmetric with the earnings and other income processes. And again, in the same way we think about the persistence across earnings or persistence across other income, we can think about the intergenerational persistence in terms of how consumption operates as saying that the Q bar of children depends upon the Q bar of parents. And that phi here is capturing the degree of intertemporal persistence that's happening from parents to their children. And what that's capturing is things like how much their desires for consumption, how much they want to save, what their perhaps how they feel about precautionary motives, and so on. The point I want to kind of stress about this model is that we've written it in a way to be deliberately agnostic about parents' intentions. what we're going to end up with is we're going to end up with a set of equations which just describe how parents and children, how their income, earnings, and consumption are related to one another. And we can, in the background, talk about different stories about parents' intentions. Just to be clear about what Q means, I guess we talk about it as being a kind of consumption shifter. It's about saying, how do you want to kind of actually allocate your consumption? But it's got these different things it could mean. It also includes higher order preference terms like prudence, saving motives, and so on. It's also got this annuitized value of your unearned, of non-earned resources like rental income and so on. But the key, I suppose, we end up with is these set of equations, which I just put up two of them to start with, relating earnings, looking at earnings and income and consumption. So in terms of earnings, what I've done is I've just, because I realize there's far too many equations on the screen. I tried to make them larger last night, realizing how big the room was. So hopefully you've got them on your laptops. So here, in terms of earnings, you can see this is just the expression for parental earnings. And then here we've got the expression for children's earnings, which comprise these two components, one component coming from the parents, one component coming from the children, the idiosyncratic component. And then with unearned income, again, we get an expression for unearned, not for unearned income, for other income, which is for the parents, and then for the children, again, relating what their the parents' other income is, and also the idiosyncratic component. If you think about consumption, it's a bit more complicated, but it's the same kind of principle. We can think about for the parents' consumption comes from three sources. It comes from the earnings, it comes from the other income, and it comes from these consumption shifters that the parents have, which determines essentially how they're going to move their resources around and how they're going to choose to spend their resources. The consumption for the children, we can map into these, when we map it through the model, you get these different channels through which parents are impacting their kids. And so again, the blue is the channels which are coming from the parents, and the red are the idiosyncratic channels. The term here, the kind of the underbrace on the right-hand side, those combined terms just add up together to give you the earnings of the child and the other income of the child, some of which comes from the parents, and some of it comes directly from the idiosyncratic components. The reason I want to kind of write down these equations to show these is I think this is the kind of heart of what we're actually going to end up with. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the variances of each of these left-hand sides. So we look at the variances of earnings of the parents and variances of the earnings of the children, and we're then going to use those variances and cross-variant covariances and different restrictions to estimate the different parameters on the right-hand side. So I think hopefully that'll be clearer in just a minute. So, but this is the kind of core of the model, and we can generalize it, can extend it and change it and so on, but this is the kind of core of what's happening. If I turn to estimation, so just a couple of comments on what we're doing and then to give you the kind of core main results. So what we're doing is we're regressing the log variable on year and cohort dummies, and we're going to use residual variation from that regression. Oh, yep.
There's a question from John Rust, and that's kind of regarding to the model. So I just wanted to let him ask you directly.
I really think it's cool the way you have this intergenerational link between parents and children. But one question is what if you put in disutility of effort, or like a leisure, and could the parents hand down preferences, so you have lazy parents leading to lazy children, and would that, in your model, if you ignore that, would that enter in your idiosyncratic component of income?
So I think it's a completely right question to ask. So if I think about the transmission of earnings from the parents to the children, one of the ways in which parents impact the earnings of their children is through their preferences for how hard they're going to work. So I could completely believe that parents who are working less hard have got preference for, if you like, the lazy parents. That then transmits into having lazy children as a kind of preference transmission. And so that will show up, if it shows up in earnings, through the earnings parameters. That's going to show up through our parameter gamma. So the earnings of the child are related to the earnings of the parent, precisely because it may be to do with the preferences for leisure. And I guess that's where we wanted to be slightly agnostic about whether or not this transmission, the gamma term here, transmitting from the parents to children, whether that was being driven by, say, human capital, or whether it was being driven by preferences. And we wanted just to kind of think about the gamma as being a measure of what's actually being captured in that transmission. I think in a lot of what we see in the literature, I realize I haven't talked about literature at all. That was my realizing I was having no time. A lot of what we talk about in the literature is we interpret gamma in a very much more human capital interpretation, whereas I don't think that's necessarily the way. And we're being deliberately agnostic about this. But you're completely right to ask that question. I think we're okay with that. Okay, so just on the so here we're going to, as I said, we're going to use residual variation. We're going to minimize the distance between empirical and theoretical moments. Just in terms of the PhDs, this is using equally weighted moments because of the lack of precision in the higher order moments. Pushed up standard errors. We can identify the model in two ways. We can use all the panel variation where we're using transitory shocks, in which case we have these kind of 48 moment conditions, 25 parameters, or we can just use the cross-section variation by taking the averaging across individuals. Okay, so just to give an example of the moment conditions, I'm just going to do, in fact, I'm not even going to, I'm just describe what we've got. We've got variances, contemporaneous covariances, and non-contemporaneous covariances. And these are variances between, looking at variances of children's earnings, variances of, this is variances of parental consumption. There's the covariances between the parental earnings and the children's earnings, covariances between the children's earnings and children's other income, and then there's the non-contemporaneous ones we can use as well. So that's just to give a flavor of what we're using from the data. These left-hand side, there's a whole bunch of different moments we're using from the left-hand side, all to do with these variances and covariances that we're relating back to these parameters of the underlying model, including these transmission parameters and also the covariances. So what we don't have is we don't have the parameters we're trying to estimate coming out of this is we can think about a set of parameters which are essentially intergenerational elasticities. And I think what we want to kind of stress here is that we're estimating these 5 different elasticities, the pass-through parameters, the gamma, the rho, the phi, the lambda, the theta. We're estimating these all together, and that actually, in one of the robustness we do is we shut down these cross effects and see how it impacts on these and so on. But that's one set of parameters we need. The other set of parameters are the underlying variances and covariances. So for instance, in the variances, we need to know what the size of these idiosyncratic fixed effects are for the children in order to do this kind of exercise that we are looking at. So that's what we are. So we're going to use our moments to get at these different parameters. As I said, the moments are these just various variances and covariances. Just a couple of comments just on the estimation results. You can see here we get these kind of these are the kind of the intergenerational persistence parameters. We get a value here of gamma, the earnings pass through about 0.23. So it looks slightly low compared to what we see in the literature. Note if we switch off the cross effects, if we switch off these 2 cross effects and impose that this be 0, then the number here goes up to about 0.34, which is closer to what we see in more of the literature. So we think that this is a way of saying that the earnings channel in itself is not the it's not the only channel going on. Anyway, so as we get the pass-through for earnings, about 0.23 of value, a bit of pass-through in other income, which turns out may need to be coming from who someone marries. So the other income in the data, when we do the kind of splitting it out, it tends to be coming from spousal earnings. The cross effects here are just saying this is how the parental earnings affect the children's other income. You can see it's a pretty important component there, which is being driven by things like the inter vivos transfers. And then finally, in terms of consumption shifters, this is kind of the preferences for spending, which come from your parents. You can see them preferences. Okay, so that's kind of some of the intergenerational persistence numbers. I'm not showing you the variance numbers just because they're in the paper. I could show them. I've got the tabs here, but I think it's more useful to think about what these then imply for the role of parents. So what I want to do is I want to take the estimates we've got of these pass-through parameters and the estimates of the underlying idiosyncratic components. And I want to ask, how important are the parents, all these different channels of the parents in the children, explaining what inequality is among the children.
So Roger
So this is,
has a comment. Do you want to say something now, or?
Yeah, before you go to the role of the parents, a quick question, Hamish. I like the composition between earning and other income. What worries me a little bit are the estimates of the raw parameters, because you can imagine the other incomes in reality includes a bunch of things that are not directly observable. And so I was wondering, so like contacts and friends of the family that can give a job to your child, whatever. So I was wondering whether this presence of measurement error could lead to underestimates of raw, and introduce the standard measurement error bias, and whether there is any strategy to deal with that.
so there are aspects of other income which we know we're not going to fully capture. The measurement error issue, the only way we've done this, or to get this at all, is we've estimated row as if other income was only one particular component of it. So we can split out other income into some of these different components which are better measured. So we can think about other income, if it was just spousal earnings, then it's much more precisely measured. And we can estimate row in that sense. And it turns out that the bulk of that row is coming through in our estimates from that transmission through spousal earnings. Now, what concerns me, given what you just said and thinking about it, is that then suggests that the other channels are being underestimated in terms of the row. I don't have a way of thinking about that. Well, I have a way of thinking about it. I have a way of getting at it in terms of the estimation. Let me take that away. But in terms of, so the way I would interpret the row we've got here, I would interpret this row as being primarily driven by the spousal earnings. Okay, so if I think now about what's the contribution of parental heterogeneity to cross-sectional variances. So what we're going to do is we can see, if we think about the parental contribution, there are these different reasons why parents can have an impact on the earnings of the child. You can see it comes through these pass-through parameters, the gamma, which is the direct pass-through. It's going to come through the theta, which is the cross effect. And it's also going to come through this covariance between the two. So what we do calculating the variance of the children's earnings, we can think about it's coming from these different components, all the components which are coming from the parent, plus the idiosyncratic component. And when we do that, the parental contribution to the underlying inequality, the cross-section inequality of children, is only 8%. We do something similar for, which to us, when we first did this, was actually surprising. We were surprised at how low that was. Surprised how low it was because you still get this kind of, in levels, you get this impact through of parents. It's not saying parents aren't important. It's just saying that the idiosyncratic component is important. If we do for other income, you can see actually the same thing. You actually get an even smaller number for the parental contribution. It's about 4.4%. When we do it for consumption and do the same thing, we end up with a number about 30%. So there's much more. So if I want to think about how do we explain inequality among children, how much do parents explain about inequality among children? You can see there's a lot of inequality, almost a third of inequality of consumption among children is explained by parents, whereas for earnings, the other income is much lower. And that then kind of speaks to this notion that there's this kind of intergenerational insurance going on, that parents are actually trying to ensure that consumption is relatively smooth. Okay, so I'm going to run out of time. I think I've got like about 3 minutes left or something. So just one experiment we did was you just randomly allocated parents in the counterfactual just to see what difference it makes. And you can just see what happens is that what parents are doing, these are the two distributions. You can see essentially if you randomize parental allocation, you compress the distribution. So you randomize parents, you compress the distribution. So we end up with this kind of finding that if you didn't have the parental channel, you would have less intragenerational dispersion, less inequality, but you'd also have less insurance being provided within a family. Okay, let me move on from that. And just one last thing I want to kind of show you is really thinking about how we think about this variance, why the variance doesn't matter more. And so what we've done here is we can think about what matters most in terms of driving these results. So is this about parental inequality or persistence? Why is it parents don't have more of an impact? So what we've done is we've fixed gamma at different values and re-estimated the model with those fixed values of the persistence. You can see here the only columns I want to focus on here, column 1 and column 6. So column 1 is how we increase gamma. Column 6 tells us what fraction of the child's inequality is explained by the parents. And you can see here our baseline is about 4%. We managed to get to numbers of like 23%, 33%, but only if we get values of gamma which are up there at about 0.6 or 0.8, which are counterfactually extremely high. So persistence matters, and we can get persistence to matter, and we can generate a role for parents in explaining the underlying inequality. But it requires very, very high counterfactual estimates of persistence in order to generate the parents actually matter. And what we end up with concluding is that what's really important here is that idiosyncratic component of children. Okay, children face. I'm going to skip over the robustness. I'm just going to just conclude. So what I want to kind of say, we'll start as facts about the evidence of greater intergenerational persistence in consumption than there is in earnings. Our core conclusion is that idiosyncratic shocks contribute much more than parental channel to inequality, looking both at earnings, other income, and at consumption. They contribute more for consumption, but it's still 70% of the inequality in consumption is driven by idiosyncratic aspects to it. And the kind of main, the other point I'd like to kind of stress is that the parental inequality itself, the fact there's parental inequality, that's not enough to trigger increased long-run inequality. We would only get long-run inequality from inequality in a particular parental generation is if there were much larger intergenerational elasticities, which don't seem to hold. And then the last point is really about just some of the kind of robustness. Okay, I should stop there.
Thank you. So yeah, let's give Hamish a hand.
All right, I have the microphone, so I guess I get to introduce myself. My name is Eric French, and I'm very excited to get to talk with you a little bit about the intergenerational elasticity of earnings, exploring the mechanisms. The previous two speakers had great lead-ins to what I'll be working on today, so I'll be working on something that's a little bit narrower than what Hamish was working on. I'm just going to focus in on the earnings channel, but I'll work on trying to dig a little bit deeper into trying to understand the particular mechanisms behind that earnings channel. I think my approach is going to be somewhat similar to his, in that I'm going to try and be a little bit agnostic as well in terms of trying to understand all these different mechanisms. Like Monica, I'm going to use data from Britain. Britain, like America, is very interesting for understanding inequality because Britain and the US are probably in competition for having the highest intergenerational persistence of earnings across any developed countries within the world. So in both countries, this question of why do high-income parents have high-income kids, it's of particular importance. Now, the literature has set up lots of different reasons for why high-income parents might have high-income children. Potential explanations include the fact that children of high-income families, they attain more years of schooling, they have higher cognitive skills, they receive more investments, and by more investments, I mean both in terms of parental time as well as school quality. And furthermore, they have different family environments. Children of high-income families, they tend to have more educated parents, so maybe those educated parents, they like to read to their kids more, maybe they're better at doing it, and they also tend to have fewer siblings, so we can think about these quantity-quality trade-off sorts of issues. So just in terms of what we're going to do within this particular paper is that we're going to quantify the importance of all these different explanations, and we'll analyze how these different explanations are related. Now, in terms of literature on something as broad as this, it's always a little bit dangerous to cite any papers because you know that you're going to probably piss off lots of eminent people within the audience in terms of people who have thought very deeply about these particular issues in terms of schooling, cognition, investments, and background. But I'll just cite some notable ones. There's also been lots of papers working on trying to decompose the sources of this intergenerational earnings persistence. Blandon et al. Is a nice example. We'll get to be a little bit deeper in terms of trying to use the life cycle model to at least motivate the importance of these different channels. Now, in terms of, in terms of particular dynamic structural models, we now have good models that can bring together at least many of these different channels, although not always all of them. Furthermore, these dynamic structural models, they often impose very strong restrictions in terms of the channels through which high-income parents can transfer resources to high-income kids. Usually it's through something that leads to just higher cognition of these kids, as well as, for example, additional years of schooling, perhaps through something such as the fact that high-income parents can pay for greater investments in terms of greater years of schooling. In terms of what we're going to do here is we're going to use, in many ways, a simpler approach to trying to think about that, and I'll share with you what that is in just a bit. In particular, we're going to use mediation analysis. So in mediation analysis, we'll be able to not fully structurally estimate all utility function parameters of the model, but we'll be able to consider a very large number of both direct and indirect effects of each channel on lifetime income. So just to give you an example of what we're thinking about here, in our data, we'll have good measures of school quality, and school quality might impact lifetime income through multiple channels. One is just if you go to a fancy school, that might give you a greater network later on in life. So in Britain, there's a phrase that's sometimes referred to as the chumocracy, for example. Just the whole idea that essentially rich parents send their kids to fancy schools, and it's not really so much the fact that skills are so high, it's just everyone kind of knows each other and they know the magic handshakes. A different channel would be that school quality impacts subsequent years of total schooling attained, and thus lifetime income. Could also be that school quality impacts cognition and thus schooling choices and lifetime income. So we're going to be able to parse out all these different channels. That's what this particular approach is going to allow us to do. Now, of course, in the context of a full-blown structural model, that would be very difficult to do because that would lead to a very large number of state variables that we need to keep track of. The second contribution is I bring to you from Britain, I bring data. So in particular, I bring data that is going to be able to link early life circumstances to outcomes across the entire life cycle. In particular, I'm going to bring data from the National Child Development Study, and it's really a remarkable data set. So even at birth, basically, here's how it works. Every single kid born in Britain in a particular week in 1958, the family of that child was interviewed when the child was first born. The family was subsequently interviewed at age 7, age 11, 16. In many of these years, the teachers of these kids were also interviewed about what the teachers thought of the parents. We also have good information on school quality, things like that. And then every 5 years, these individuals wind up being interviewed, 5 years more or less. So in particular, we're going to have good information on parental income. So we have parental income when the child was age 16. We have that individual's earnings over their entire life cycle. And furthermore, we have lots of potential drivers of the intergenerational elasticity of earnings. I'll start to show you some of these particular variables right now. So just in terms of some key facts that I want to present to you. So first of all, kids of high-income parents, they tend to grow up in a different family background, so they have more educated parents and less siblings. They receive more investments, and these investments come in many different forms. I'll show you a little bit in terms of just a very small subsample of these investments that we have information on. So what I want you to see right here is that, for example, we have information from, for example, the parents of these kids. And so we have information in terms of the share of fathers who wind up going on outings with the child when the child was around age 7. Amongst families where income was in the bottom third of the distribution, about 65% of all fathers went to these outings with their kids. If we look at those in the top percentile of the income distribution, the number was closer to 71.5%. This p-value for the test of equality of these two different coefficients in blue, that shows that we can reject equality at any reasonable level. So what I want you to take away from these particular numbers is that you can see that there are these gradients in terms of high-income parents tend to invest more in their kids across all these different measures. The gradients, I don't want to say that they're shockingly large, but these gradients are there for just about every single measure that you can think of. Now, not only do we have time investments, but we also have school quality. And again, we have lots of different measures of school quality. I'm just showing you a subset of these measures here. We have lots of measures such as whether the school has, for example, parent-teacher association meetings. We have measures such as student-teacher ratios, and we have that at multiple ages. We also have measures of, for example, whether or not kids at that school are studying for to take exams that lead them on to higher education. Again, what you can see is across all these different measures is that for the most part, those kids who are born to parents in high income levels, they are going to better schools across lots of different measures. Now, not only do they get greater, not only do they receive more investments, but they also have better outcomes. And we'll measure this in terms of different measures of skills at age 16. So we have both standardized measures where these kids take tests that are constant through all members of the sample, and as well as we also have lots of different measures such as teacher evaluations of how these kids are doing. So just in terms of differences in cognition, what you can see is that for multiple measures, kids born to parents in the top of the income distribution perform about 1/10 of a standard deviation above average in terms of test scores. Kids born to parents at the bottom of the distribution, they're about 1/10 of a standard deviation below average. And then we also have the fact that kids born to high education parents, they attain more years of schooling. Okay. Let me tell you now a little bit about the approach. So there's 3 basic steps that I'm going to show you. The first step is we're going to think about using all these different measures of time investments, school quality investments, cognition, and the like. And we're going to use all these different measures to come up with latent factor scores for cognition, time investments, and the like. So a key part of this is how to bring together lots of different bits of information. Next, we'll estimate the intergenerational elasticity of earnings, and then we'll decompose that intergenerational elasticity of earnings into multiple channels, allowing for increasing degrees of mediation. Okay. So we've now in this conference seen these latent factor models a few different times. I'll just give you a quick review in terms of what we're going to be doing. In terms of what we have right here, so we have some underlying latent factor, omega. Think of that as, for example, cognition. We're going to have lots of different measures of omega. So that's Z subscript M. So that would be, for example, math scores, reading scores, different types of teacher evaluations for these particular students. All these measures of ability, they'll all be on different scales. So we want to estimate these loading factors. And then we're going to have to deal with the fact that there's measurement error in these data, just because, for example, if we take a test, most of us at some point in our lives have screwed up some sort of test, right? So we know there's going to be noise in the numbers. So just in terms of what we're going to do to address that particular problem is that first we'll estimate measurement system parameters. The basic idea is that we just use GMM using basically one measure of cognition, for example, to instrument for the other. And in a system GMM approach, we can estimate both the lambda parameters, so the loading factors, as well as the measurement error terms. Next, we'll take a weighted average of all these different measures, properly scaled in terms of, for example, cognition. And the weights will be according to the precision of, or how informative those particular measures are for understanding cognition. Now, of course, there's still going to be measurement error in that latent factor. Okay, so we've addressed the fact that these different measures that are on different scales, and things like that, but we haven't fully addressed the fact that there's measurement error in these variables. But we can estimate the amount of measurement error, and so we can estimate the informativeness of all the different measures. And so we can correct for measurement error using an errors in variables formula. So the appendices of Heckman papers are always of great value. So I highly recommend, I think it's about Appendix H of Heckman 2013. And basically he gives all the bits of how to address this problem in that particular paper. So the equations that I'm going to show you in just a bit, they're all just going to be linear. But the tricky part is going to be that we're going to have lots of different measures. All these different measures are, or all these different variables are measured with error. And so the appendix of Heckman 2013 kind of shows how to address that particular problem. And again, the key trick is that we know the variance of measurement error, so we can use that. Yes?
Quick question. Child with disability will be captured in this measure?
So the question is, would child disability be captured in this measure? So it would be interesting to think about a more multi-dimensional approach, for example, health. So to the extent that disability would be highly correlated with cognition, this approach would capture it. So that would be an interesting extension that we have not tried. So we've tried, so in terms of this particular paper, we're just going to focus in on cognition. We've also extended the model to think about non-cognitive skills, but we could think about adding in health, and that would be an interesting thing to do. Just to give you a sense of how informative these different measures are. So what you can see is that for cognition at age 16, both math and reading scores, whether it's on these standardized measures or these teacher evaluated measures, they're all reasonably informative. But what I want you to also take away is that for some of these measures, for example, a very popular measure of school quality is the student-teacher ratio. You can see that is not a particularly informative measure of school quality. We have lots better measures of school quality. Okay. That's what I have to say about measurement error, and we'll return to that in just a bit. So just in terms of estimating the intergenerational elasticity of earnings, the key parameter that we're interested in here is just rho. So everything is d-means here, so there's no intercept in the equation or anything like that. We're going to estimate rho, and then we're essentially going to try to decompose all the sources of that correlation. In terms of what we're going to do in what we'll refer to as a baseline decomposition of the intergenerational elasticity of earnings, what we'll do is we'll regress child's earnings on all these different variables, whether it's years of schooling, cognition, lots of different measures of parental investments, and also parental background. We'll also estimate how those are impacted by parents' income. And we'll use that approach to try and think about what are the different shares of earnings that are explained through these different mechanisms. Now, just in terms of the basic estimation approach, what you can see here is that what I'm going to show you is just a very simple linear case with a little bit extra work. We can bring interactions, and we've tried interactions, for example, between school quality and cognition. The main results in this paper, they don't change if we allow for that sort of complementarity. So it is true that if you add in an interaction between, for example, years of schooling and cognition, that coefficient will be positive. So that's consistent with what lots of other people have found, kind of this idea of complementarity between schooling and also skills. But just in terms of the main results, they don't change, and the decompositions are more straightforward when we just have a simple linear case. So we'll focus in on that. In terms of what we're going to do is we're going to have income. That's going to be a function of years of schooling, cognition, these different investment measures that we have, family background, and also parents' income. So if we think about what we would usually do in terms of writing down a dynamic programming model of the intergenerational elasticity, we would certainly have kids' income be a function of, say, years of schooling and cognition. We probably would not have some of these other variables in the regression. So we think this is actually one of the benefits of this particular approach. So for example, we can test whether or not this coefficient on parents' income, whether or not that is 0 or not. So in lots of structural models, it would be assumed to be 0. But for example, when Hamish was talking and John Russ brought up the issue that, for example, it could be just the case that hardworking parents have hardworking kids. That's a particular channel that wouldn't be captured just through, for example, years of schooling and cognition necessarily. Again, we can think about other channels as well. So for example, I was talking about the chumocracy before. Maybe high-income parents, they know the right person to call to kind of help their kids climb the ladder. So for that reason, we're going to throw this in there and we're going to test whether or not it's important and significant. So in particular, we can test lots of different restrictions that are typically made within the literature. Now, just in terms of what we're going to do to try and think about how much of this intergenerational persistence in earnings is mediated, for example, through cognition, what we'll do is we'll estimate cognition as a function of parents' income. And the share of the IGE explained by cognition then, it's going to be, so in the denominator, that's just rho, that's the intergenerational elasticity of earnings. So that's the covariance of parents and kids' income, just divided by the variance of parents' income. And in the numerator, what we have are two things. So first we have kappa C, so that's just going to be the covariance of parents' income with cognition divided by the variance of parents' income. And then alpha here, so that's just the extent to which higher cognition leads to higher earnings. So that's all that's going on here. So in this baseline decomposition, it's all quite straightforward. Now, of course, this considers only the direct effect of cognition on lifetime earnings. If we're interested in to what extent do greater investments of high-income parents, to what extent do they lead to higher income through kids? Well, we capture part of it here just through this direct mechanism, but we also want to think about these more indirect mechanisms, such as investments leading to higher cognition, years of schooling, and the like. So that's what we're going to do in these other levels of this mediation approach. In particular, in level 2, what we'll do is we'll allow years of schooling to be a function of all these other different objects here, cognition, investments, family background, all things that would be at least in part determined earlier in the life cycle. So we're not imposing all the structure of the life cycle model that is typically assumed, but we still want that timing structure. So the life cycle model is still central here in terms of helping us think about the levels of mediation. Now, just in terms of this level 2 analysis, what we'll do is we'll allow years of schooling to be a function of, for example, cognition and other variables. And so in what we'll call our level 2 analysis, the share of the IGE explained by cognition is going to be what we had before, essentially this channel by which higher parental income leads to higher cognition, and the extent to which higher cognition leads to higher income of the kids. But we're bringing in this additional channel, and this additional channel is what we refer to as the indirect effect. So the indirect effect is going to account for the fact that high income parents attain more years of schooling, so that's the beta C. And then the next part is the extent to which high income parents both have kids with higher cognition, as well as the extent to which in the first stage, to what extent do years of schooling impact children's earnings over the life cycle. Okay, so then we can also go to level 3, and we can also go to level 4, and increasingly allowing more factors to impact, for example, years of schooling. Okay, let me show you some numbers now. On the right-hand side, we just have basic estimates of the intergenerational elasticity of earnings. So that's using a somewhat noisy measure of parents' income at when the child was age 16. So again, kind of the key technical contribution of this paper is that it allows for very general types of measurement error throughout the whole procedure. We have additional data that tells us essentially the covariance of income when the parent's income when the child was 16 relative to overall variance in parental income over the life cycle, as well as a few extra correlations. And what we can do with that is we can kind of blow up the estimates of the IGE to address that measurement error problem. So what you can see is that more or less the intergenerational elasticity of earnings, it's about 0.3 in these data. I guess Hamish had similar numbers for the US. Okay, good. Now let's get to the punchlines in terms of this paper. Here, this is really the key figure that I want you to remember tomorrow. Now, this, first of all, just shows our first level of our mediation analysis. What it shows is the share of the IGE explained through the channels that we have. So in particular, what this shows is that we can explain 54% of the IGE through the channels that we're considering here. So we can't explain all of it. So again, we've come up with some ideas in terms of what that might be, whether it's the persistence of preferences across generations for work, whether it's something about family connections, something like that. But what it shows is that at some level, close to half of this intergenerational earnings persistence is unexplained via the usual channels by which we would kind of set up a dynamic structural model. Years of schooling, the fact that high-income parents have kids who attain more years of schooling, that can explain 10% of the intergenerational elasticity of earnings. The cognition channel can explain 33%. Time investments can explain a little bit above and beyond their impact on cognition. And in terms of both years of schooling and cognition are statistically significant, although the other ones aren't. Now, in this next step, what we can do is we can try to work through to what extent is the higher years of schooling of kids of high-income parents, to what extent can it be explained via higher cognition and also higher investments? And what you can see right here is that it can be fully explained via cognition and investment. So we could think about models, for example, where it is difficult psychologically for kids with low levels of cognition to wind up going on and attaining, for example, a college degree. The fact that cognition can fully explain it, it's also evidence against, for example, a common idea within the literature that borrowing constraints are particularly important. Okay. Yeah.
It's a question from Joseph Mullins.
Yep.
And I see it's not allowed to maybe.
Oh, is this my question? Sorry. Oh, I think I hear. Okay, I'm gonna assume that awkward silence was a yes. It's a question about mediation analysis. So do we have to assume for this to work that there is, a single variable at the top of the causal chain, parental income in this case, that's like sending out everything else? Is that the only way we can do this decomposition?
So let me make sure that I understand the question. So certainly it doesn't have to be that parental income causes these different things. So at some level, when we're thinking about the fact that high-income parents, that they have more kids, it's just an association. So we don't think about all of these things necessarily as being causal. In terms of that initial level, it's just an association. And then I think in terms of parental income doesn't need to be the only thing that causes everything. Certainly, we're allowing for epsilons in all our different equations, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. I think what you're telling me is, don't think of this. Think of this as decomposition of an association. When you showed us the life cycle model and you had parental income at the bottom, that to me, I wrote in my mind a model where that, parental income then is the right-hand side, is the exogenous variable that's sort of then gonna throw everything else forward. But it's okay. I was just curious about that. Yeah.
To think about all these results through the lens of the life cycle model, absolutely. It's just that I want you to think about high-income parents. They tend to have fewer kids, whether that's via preferences or whether it's something about substitution effects and the cost of having kids. We're being agnostic about it at that level.
Got you. Okay. It would be useful, like I would never do this myself, but all of a sudden I'm thinking it would be useful to see just like the graph of the I think there is some causal language here. It'd be good to see like which part is explicitly causal and which is just an association caused by the links in the chain. Anyway, that you answered my question, so I'm stop talking. Thanks.
The language, yeah, I should work on trying to make it a little more precise when I want you to take certain things as being causal versus not. Absolutely. For the next step, we're going to allow cognition to be a function of investments. And so what you can take away from this third level is that investments can almost fully explain the higher cognition of kids of relatively high-income parents. Time investments, at least for men, seem like they're more important than school quality investments. Still, family background is relatively unimportant. And then at the fourth level of mediation, where we allow, for example, investments to be a function of family background variables, what you can see is that investments are still very important, even once we condition on the fact that high-income parents have fewer kids and the like. So what I want you to take away from this is that high-income parents they do have high-income kids, and kind of the key driver seems like it is these investments, and these investments cannot be explained via, for example, family background variables. Here are the same numbers for females. A few differences that are worthy of note. The first is that years of schooling is more important for women than for men. Second, we can explain a somewhat higher share of the IGE through the channels that we consider. But I think the main results are fundamentally the same. When all is said and done, the key driver of the intergenerational elasticity of earnings, it's different types of investments at different points in the life cycle. Okay. So schooling and cognition, they explain large shares of the IGE, but those are mediated via investments. Now, how much time do I have? 5 minutes. Okay. So one thing that we can do is we can formally test to what extent these different channels are important versus not in a statistical sense. So in terms of some key assumptions that are made within the literature, usually we assume that both time and school quality investments, that they do not directly impact lifetime earnings. That seems to hold up within these estimates. And what you can also see is that these time and school quality investments, for example, the key thing that they impact is cognition. The second thing that I want to show you in terms of a non-trivial extension is what's going on in terms of measurement error. So in terms of what I've shown you, most of this is pretty straightforward stuff. The only technically fancy part of this paper is working out all the details of measurement error. And so we might be interested in whether measurement error is actually important, whether basically all the work that we did was largely for naught, and we could have done all this without measurement error, which all would have been quite simple. Happily for us, it does seem as though accounting for measurement error, it is important. So just in terms of what I've shown you before, so I've shown you all the results in this table graphically just a couple of slides ago. This is just for men, for example. If it's bold, that means that it's statistically significant. And the thing that I really want you to key in on is, for example, thinking about cognition. So cognition, of course, that's measured with error. And if we just think about the usual idea, when errors in variables models, if there's measurement error in a variable, we know that the coefficient on that is going to be biased towards 0. And indeed, what you can see is that that winds up being important. Cognition, in terms of level 2, that explains half of the intergenerational elasticity of earnings. If we just focus in on a single measure of cognition, you can see that the share explained, it falls by about 1/3. And so, of course, you have to pick a particular measure when thinking about a single measure to kind of give the benefit of the doubt to trying to think, well, maybe measurement error isn't so important. We always pick the most informative measure. Mike. You're on mute.
Eric, going back to the results?
Yeah.
I guess I'm pretty confused how to interpret it. Are you saying that cognitive ability of parents and schooling of parents primarily affects outcomes for kids because it affects how much the parents invest in the kids?
No.
Rather than through some direct inheritance of ability?
Thank you for the question. So just as clarification, this is not cognition of the parents. This is cognition of the kids. So what we're doing here is we're having cognition of the kid be a function of income of the parent. Does that clarify?
No, I'm just, does the sort of the, is there any role here for inheritance of ability, or is that just in the residual?
So if there is a role of inheritance of ability, so our claim is that where we should expect to see it is that if we looked at, for example, the final level 4 analysis, where we're thinking about indirect effects via investments, that high income parents would have high ability kids, even controlling for investments and the like. So if the way we're thinking about this is that would be the place that you would be looking to see some evidence of something about some inherent intergenerational persistence of cognition.
So can you put a number on that? Like how much of the intergenerational correlation in income is just because smart parents have smart kids?
We could do that. So that'd be a good thing to do. We have not done that. So what I can say is that what you can see is at the level 4 that 11% of the intergenerational elasticity of earnings is still explained by the fact that high income parents have high cognition kids controlling for everything else. That's statistically significant. So we could work out a little bit more a model to think about ability transmission, some direct ability transmission. We haven't done it. It would be statistically insignificant. But
okay.
Interesting thing to do though. And for women, you can see that winds up being basically 0. Okay. So just again, in terms of the role of measurement error. So what you can see is that measurement error, controlling for measurement error, it does have a big impact on our results. The results, they seem like they're robust for thinking about non-cognitive skills. Non-cognitive skills do, to some extent, increase future earnings, although at least our measure of non-cognitive skills, it suggests that it's not very highly correlated with, for example, parental income. So parental income, high income parents, they tend to have conscientious yet neurotic kids, and kind of those sort of all seem like they kind of wash out. We've also tried complementarity between years of schooling and cognition to try and think about these sorts of issues. Also not important. Also other family background variables didn't seem to be too important. So in conclusion, more than half of the intergenerational elasticity of earnings is explained by differences in years of schooling, cognition, parental investments, and family circumstances in childhood. And the main driver of the IGE, the thing that I want you to take away, is that it is via parental investments received early in life, which leads to higher cognitive development and subsequent earnings. Thank you very much. We have talked about that a lot, but so far it's been only armchair theorizing and not really worth me telling you kind of all the things that we've talked through. I'm certainly interested in people's opinions of what might be the source of that. Right. Yeah, I think the two approaches are complementary. So thank you for the question. The twin studies, arguably the causality is perhaps cleaner. However, things like twin studies, they often lead us to only think about one particular channel of causality. Whereas here we can think about all the different channels, and we can think about estimating something that looks like at least the reduced form to a structural model. And so in that sense, the nice thing about what we can do here is that we can think a little bit more deeply about the different channels. So one thing that we have tried to do is we have tried to think to what extent is endogeneity important by looking at twin studies relative to OLS estimates. And you know what, our takeaway is that for most of these channels, all these endogeneity problems, they're really not that important. If I were to worry about things such as endogeneity because through different channels versus measurement error, I would focus in on measurement error.